All right, hello there, folks. First off, I'm obviously not at my usual location. As I said, I was heading out to Japan. Right now, I'm actually at my in-laws' place, and I'm trying to make all of this work despite not having my usual editing rig at home. So I'm leaving for Japan at 3 in the morning, and I'm trying to quickly get this thing out. But you're going to have to bear with me for a couple weeks because I'm using a crappier, slower computer with no editing software on it. So you're going to have to find a way to live without having my usual brilliant visual effects and and that sort of thing that I usually am able to have, and instead deal with my giant head. I don't know why this is all zoomed in on my head like this. It's ridiculous. Anyway, I'm aware that most of you probably just minimize me and listen anyway, so hopefully this won't end up being too much of an intrusion. But I do apologize if the next few videos are a little bit drier than what I've usually been putting out. Anyway, I want to say there was a great discussion last week. The katana was definitely the winner for zombie removal devices. I think people justified it really well using the dimensions of a successful innovation. For me, I think I'd go baseball bat, but I do that mostly because of the katana's complexity, right? But it would be very, very close between the two. I think you guys justified your decisions really well. And there were crossbow users in the class, and so I mean, if you already know how to use a crossbow, then yeah. Use the crossbow. Stay at a range. Just make sure you retrieve your bolts. Anyway, this week we are going to be looking at a bunch of topics. We're going to be looking at uses and gratifications, which is a kind of sort of theory, which basically talks about why people do things. We're going to be talking about persuasion and a couple of persuasion theories, which is about how we get people to do our things. We're going to be talking about health communication, which is where we figure out if people are doing the things. And then we're going to be talking about political communication, where we use the things we know to make people do the things. All right, let's get started. We're going to start off this week with uses and gratifications. And now here is a very rough cut. So with uses and gratifications, it asks a very basic question. It just asks, why is it that people do what they do? And what its answer to this is that it says, well, people have needs. They have a variety of needs, and that the media is capable of filling some of those needs. Not all of them, right? Like, we need to eat in order to survive, and media can't do anything for us there. But we need to be informed. We need to be told how to think about things. We need to be told what things are out there. We need to be oriented. We need to be entertained. We need to have norms established, that sort of thing. And media performs that function for us. By the way, I want to talk just really quickly about norms, right? Because you're in college, and so everything that you hear about norms is terrible, right? Like, it's a strong encouragement to challenge norms. And there are some norms that are out there that suck and deserve to be challenged, right? But people talk about norms as though they're bad or optional, and that it's awesome to break them. And maybe sometimes that's the case, right? Very, very, very rarely, though, is that the case, right? And I can tell you this because I am a father, and I have 2 little girls. And I can tell you that norm instruction is absolutely crucial, because we take so much of what is normal completely for granted, right? So, like, it would not be an unusual interaction with my daughter to say, no, bad girl, we do not poop in our library books, right? This would not be a strange conversation to have, right? It's completely a norm. Why don't we poop in our library books? It's because the man tells us not to poop in our library books, right? I mean, there's good reasons for it, right? Other people are going to be using those library books for one. We don't keep those. Even if it was a book that we keep, I wouldn't really want her pooping in it, right? But that's completely a norm. And it's one I really would prefer if she stopped challenging, right? So just because people talk about challenging norms as though it's a really cool and interesting thing to do, these are things that we just take for granted, right? That's why they're called norms. They're things that we don't usually think about, but they are things that need to be taught. And when people tell you to challenge them, be at least a little bit skeptical about what you're being told, even though it always sounds cool. That being said, also be aware some norms do suck, and have the intellectual capacity to recognize when that's the case, and be able to dump those. But in general, take the argument, challenge norms with a grain of salt. Okay, norms are very, very important, and their transmission is absolutely crucial. Right, if you want to be able to function within a society, norm transmission is highly important. Even when you get to very superficial type things, right? Like in the United States, you shouldn't slurp your soup, and in Japan you should, right? Like I'm on my way out there. I'm going to have ramen, and I am going to slurp it when I eat it, and that's rude here, and it's not rude there. And those are totally norms, and there's nothing wrong with them. And honestly, if you challenge them, you're probably just being a punk, right? There's no good reason to challenge that norm. It's just something to be aware of, right? And it's a transmission, and that's like a very superficial base level norm. Generally speaking, norms exist for really good reasons, like don't poop in library books. All right. Anyway, that is a total, not a total digression, but that is a pretty decently sized digression. Let's move back onto the topic of uses and gratifications.
Now, just like the other theories that we've talked about, uses and gratifications has to make some rather large-scale assumptions. Now, some of these assumptions that it makes because it's hoping to address some of the problems of previous theories, especially magic bullet theory. One of the big assumptions that it makes is it assumes that the audience is active. You'll recall with cultivation theory that we assumed a passive audience, that they would just watch, and you would sit down and everything that you did was habitual. In uses and gratifications, it requires that the people who are watching are actually thinking about what they're watching. Now, that might be a decent assumption. I don't know if that's always the case. Like, how often do you really meditate on what you're going to put on TV? It would assume that media is used for specific gratifications. Like, you go into watching television with a specific objective in mind. It would also suggest that social and psychological factors mediate people's communication behavior. In other words, when you go into it, your brain is carefully balancing a lot of factors in order for you to make a determination about what you're going to watch. It would suggest that media compete with alternatives for selection and use. So let's say the need you need to have filled is you need to be entertained. It would suggest that there are a wide array of things that could potentially entertain you, and you're going into it with your own perspective as to what is going to entertain you the most, right? Just like we talked about at the start of the semester with if you prefer film and TV or video games, and we all had different answers for those three media. It would assume that differences among audience members cause people to do radically different things. So first off, different people will seek out different messages, right? As a video game player, my preference is for large-scale, sweeping, open-world RPGs like Fallout 4 and like Skyrim, right? You listen to the other video game players, I think both of them were more into sports games. So we're going into the same media, but we're seeking out different messages, right? Then it would suggest that we use the messages that we get differently. If I were to watch, oh, let's see, what was a popular TV show? I think somebody said Walking Dead, and I like Walking Dead. If I watch Walking Dead and somebody else from our class watches Walking Dead, it's the uses and gratifications would say the two of us are going to get different things out of Walking Dead. Even though it's a uniform message, the things that we're going to get out of it are going to be drastically different. And then we're going to take those messages and we're going to use them differently. Maybe for one person, it's escapism. Maybe for one person, it's entertainment. Maybe for one person, it's actually fulfilling an instructional role, like they're actually interested in how they might hunker down in a survival situation. And then finally we'll respond to them differently. It'll serve a different need within us. Now when we're looking at uses and gratifications, there's really three primary objectives to it. First off, it wants to explain how media use gratifies particular needs. It wants to understand motives for media behavior, right? Why we do what we do. And then finally, it wants to identify functions or consequences resulting from needs, motives, and exposure. So in other words, it wants to see what our behaviors are in response to our needs. And whether or not those gratifications were fulfilled. The gratifications that we sought were in fact the gratifications that we obtained. To this end, there are four models that we're going to look at. Uses and gratifications, it's only kind of a theory, because you'll notice that in those three objectives, none of them say predictive. And of course, in order to have a good scientific theory, it needs to have predictive power. But uses and gratifications can never predict behavior. All it's ever good for is explaining why somebody did something. Using that, then, it's not really a great theory, but people do use it to develop models which do have some explanatory power, at least. And the four that we're going to look at are called the transactional model, the gratification seeking and audience activity model, the expectancy value model, and the uses and dependency model. With the transactional model, it's a very simple model, at least. There's only two real elements to it. On the one hand, you've got message characteristics, right? What it contains, what it says, what cues it contains, what feelings it might evoke, and what it intends to do, right? And then you've got the psychological traits of the audience or the viewer, right? And that these two things then combine to create the overall message reception, use, and gratification, right? So this is where I hate not having access to editing software, because now I can't show you guys a picture. But imagine a 2x2 grid, okay? This would mean then that in one of those cells in the grid, you could have powerful media effects take place. So this can still account for, those rare instances in which media really strongly resonates with you. And it would occur when the user's orientation and the message being delivered by the media are in, perfect alignment, where the message is directly hitting exactly what it is that the person went into this interaction looking for. It would suggest that happens pretty rarely, but it would be it's at least possible. So it's kind of a handy model. You've also got the gratification seeking and audience activity model, right? This would say that user needs influence uses and effects, right? So in other words, I need certain things when I'm going into a piece of media. Presumably that piece of media offers a wide spectrum of things, but I'm looking to it for one thing, and I've selected it for one thing. Now, the idea here then is that with attention, reaction, and behavioral intentions, those are going to be drawn and directed by particular needs and gratifications that I'm looking for, and my attitude towards the message itself and how involved in it I can become. The expectancy value model, in my opinion, is actually the most interesting of the uses and gratifications models. What it does is it parses out the gratifications that you go into a piece of media looking to have gratified, and then the ones that you actually get from it. To me, this is a much more realistic way of looking at how we engage in using media. I will hop on my computer with the intention of getting work done, and that my stress level would reduce by getting that work done, right? And that I might achieve a sense of fulfillment and so forth. Anything that you get associated with work completion. I'll get on the computer and instead I'll surf the web and I'll goof off for a while. That probably results in a little bit of stress reduction. it also is going to result in some other things, right? I'm going to be entertained. It probably offers me some escapism. And so I went into it looking to get something out of it. Instead, I got something different. And that's the difference in this model between gratifications sought, what I went looking for, and gratifications obtained, what I actually ended up getting out of the media. So it can explain a much broader array of behaviors, right? Maybe the initial push, like the selection, was made with this in mind, and then something else happened, right? Uh, this then ends up being a superior tool for explanation, because very frequently, let's say what I really need is to be entertained, but I'm going to try to do some work, right? That means there are things in my house that can entertain me far better than my computer can, right? But I go to my computer and then it ends up serving the entertainment need because I went to it looking for something else. The last model that we're going to look at today is the uses and dependency model. Um, this one talks more about what I would call soft addiction. Soft addiction is something that we often talk about in communication circles as it relates to people saying, oh, so and so has become addicted to television, or addicted to video games, or addicted to World of Warcraft, that sort of thing. Um, you can say addiction there, but you don't really mean addiction, right? An addiction is when you develop a chemical dependency on something. And because media provides no chemicals, right? Until we invent media that has an IV for you, you can't actually develop a chemical addiction to media. However, it can become highly habituated so that the end effect looks for all the world like an addiction. I call that a soft addiction. Uses and dependency would say it's the result of two factors. First off, viewers' motives for obtaining particular gratifications, and then the availability of viewing alternatives, right? So um, let's say I need information, and I really only have one place that I can turn. My dependency on that medium is going to get very, very, very high, right? And it's going to propose that certain elements in a media system can cause me to single out and completely depend upon the media for that particular thing, right? And it strengthens the message effects. If I have no other channel of information coming in, then the information that I get from that source is going to be very strong. If I am dependent upon World of Warcraft to give me entertainment, then I'll get entertainment out of that and pretty much out of nothing else. Even though there are in fact options out there, this one has completely crushed them all, and they don't matter anymore. That's where this one would approach the idea of dependency from. Now, just like we've started going over assumptions when we talk about some of these theories, we're also going to now start talking about some of the criticisms of these theories. Now, with magic bullet theory and so forth, the criticism was easy because its predicted values were so sweeping. They were patently ridiculous. Like any measured thinking person who looked at them these days would dismiss them out of hand. But every theory has its flaws and its problems and its critics. And so the criticisms of uses and gratifications can be pretty big. You've already heard one from me, that it's got no predictive power. Because it's got no predictive power, it's hard to even call it a scientific theory. It doesn't really meet that criteria. It's highly individualistic, right? You remember what we said was that every single user was going to get something different out of it. Well, that's not a theory. That means anytime you see any effect, you're just explaining it in the light of that sole person right there. There's no ability then to synthesize research findings, because if all media hits all people in a different way, and that different way cannot be predicted, you can't really conduct a formalized lab experiment. What would you hypothesize? That this will do something different for everybody? You can't predict a null result. So it's kind of an impossible theory to test. There's a lack of clarity among some of the key concepts, right? Define a use, right? When I go into a media experience, am I really thinking about some specific need that I need to have addressed? Is the word need even specific enough thing to test? Most people would say no, and I would be one of them. Uh, there's a question in the belief of an active audience, right? How active are people really in choosing their media? At the very least, you are constrained by choice and by value, right? Like let's say that okay, well, let's say you are a Christian and you are looking to view some Christian programming, right? First off, the need that you have there is you would like to have your faith strengthened a little bit, right? And we can take Christian and replace it with any religion, right? This is pan-religious, right? Uh, you can go and you can find programming that will do that, right? But first off, you've got to find it. Second off, it's going to be pretty limited in availability, right? It's not like all stations are going to have something specifically for that. And then finally, once you actually get to it, there's a quality issue, right? What if the program might scratch that particular itch for you, but it's useless, right? Like you just don't like it. It's badly done, right? Or the story is bad, or you just can't get involved in it, right? There's there is a limit to how active we can be, and it's limited by what's available. Then, of course, there's the usual complaints about self-report, right? You'll see it in your PowerPoint, but the self-report complaint is that we don't talk about ourselves very accurately, especially in some regards. If I were to ask you, if on a questionnaire, how racist are you, right? Nobody's going to answer, towards the top of that scale because we know it's wrong and nobody's going to consider themselves racist, regardless of what reality is. People are going to answer that very low. And so self-report is kind of middling in its quality, but honestly, there's not really any good way around it. All right, let's wrap up uses and gratifications there, and we will move on to persuasion.